permission, the document belongs with the second supplementary statement of Mr. Linnell, which is found on page 24. I beg your pardon, let me refer to the black pagination. Page 27.
Yeah, 24 is the red one.
That's correct, sir. 27, 28.
You want it to be put immediately after
Page 28.
Page 28, and it will be page 28.1.
Correct, Chairperson.
Okay, all right.
And 28.2. Mr. Linnell, you see the document, ESCOM Energy Crisis Load Sabotage.
I do.
Yeah. So you were busy explaining to the chairperson that this is a document, I think as I recall, you would have received from Jabu, Mr. Jabu Maswanganyi.
That is my recollection, sir. It was first, I found it by it's having been saved to my computer on the 8th of March, 2015. And although it's not authored in any apparent way, the metadata demonstrated where the document originated and came from. And that ultimately was Jabu.
Yes. You have familiarized yourself with the contents of this document.
I have indeed.
Are you able to, in a nutshell, relate to the chairperson what is contained in this document? Or should...
I will do. Mr. Chair, the document reviews a number of power plants within the ESCOM group, but mainly deals with alleged corruption, maladministration, both at some of these plants, but also in respect of some procurement issues. And it appears to specifically target a number of individuals.
Are you finished? Okay. Check.
Unless you want me to elaborate?
Yes. May I read it quickly to the record?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Mr. Linnell, I'm going to read it to the record. Quickly, I'll go through it. Introduction, say, ESCOM has the total generation capacity of 43,000 megawatts. The current capacity is under strain due to the aging power plants. Yes, it's true that some of the load shedding was necessary to protect the grid from the blackout. But in recent years, load shedding has become a concern since it's driven by unclear factors. This report will unveil how ESCOM executives collide with the contractors to sabotage load capacity, creating what is known as load losses. Mr. Linnell, what do you understand with that paragraph?
I think it's relating some of the power outages directly to the performances of certain ESCOM executives, and I think it's suggesting that there would be intentional behavior as well as normal maintenance backlogs.
Okay, so you're saying in addition to normal maintenance, load shedding could have been, I use the word, for lack of a better word, manipulated.
That is what the document appears to suggest, yes.
Yeah. So what it means is there would have been incidents of load shedding which were not necessitated by the need to load shed, but merely done by some people within Eskom when there was no need to load shed?
Correct, Mr. Chairman. The one word used there is sabotage load, or the phrase is sabotage load capacity. So that would have quite a dire interpretation.
So when you were given this document, if you can recall, as you say, coming from Mr. Maswanganyi, what was the reason, what was his explanation in providing you with this document?
I cannot state, but my recollection of the conversation was this indicates intentional disruption of the power grid. The whole document as a whole indicates intentional disruption, and secondly, maladministration. So that, in a sense, is also intentional.
So that aspect would have become part of what you would later draft as the terms of reference for the inquiry?
Mr. Chairman, when I would have read this document, it would have conveyed to me that there was the possibility of intentional disruption, as well as what one read frequently at that time, corruption as well. So these specific instances probably would have ended up as being followed through in the investigation, but what it indicated to me at that time that these were indicative of some substance, be it allegations, that required to be investigated.
Yes.
So it was a meaningful document.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, but my question was, did sabotage, the load capacity sabotage, become part of the terms of reference that you would later draft?
I don't think that term was used in terms of reference. I think that would have been, I wouldn't have relied on this, the terminology of this document to direct the terms of reference. The terms of reference were more broadly framed, but they would have included this by anyone getting into the terms of reference. So the terminology I would have avoided because it's descriptive.
I see. Okay, the second paragraph, Western Cape gas-fired power station. Western Cape gas-fired power stations. Western Cape has 2 gas-fired power stations, Ankerlug, Saldanha, Saldanha, Gorukwa, Mossel Bay. Given the lack of adequate access to natural gas, the 2 power stations have been operating on diesel. The 2 power stations have been operating on diesel on a peak load basis, meaning that they are not always switched on. Well, you can see I'm correcting as I read there. They only operate during peak hours, which is from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. The 2 power stations have been converted to base load capacity, meaning that they now operate 24 hours non-stop. The reason for this conversion into a base load capacity is driven by the greed of Eskom executives to benefit from the diesel supply contracts and political sabotage through load sabotage. There again we see the concept load sabotage. Did you do anything to investigate what is being alleged in this document?
No, at this stage they just form part of the input into me drafting the ultimate terms of reference. So all these issues would have been covered in one way or another in the terms of reference. But there were 2 points here, I think, which is significant. And again, it comes back to comment we were talking about before lunch, because this indicates greed, which is a form of corruption, but it also talks about political sabotage, which has another connotation altogether. So if you haven't, whether it's true or not, at this stage it didn't matter. The implication was, if you were going to find out what was going on at ESCOM, one had to be clear that influences on those scores were not going to interfere with getting to the bottom of it.
Yes, well, as we continue on that document, I'm reminded of what you said in your affidavit about the documentation given by you, or given to you, if not given, but at least shown to you by Mr. Jabu. If you could please go to page 32 of your, in the bundle, which is a page in your affidavit. Paragraph 17 on page 32.
Yes, that is referring to this document.
It would have referred to, okay, let me read. It says, to the best of my recollection, Jabu had a number of documents that dealt with alleged events at ESCOM. These were largely from unidentified sources and unverified content. These were things that an investigation would identify and were background in context. But in part, some of the allegations did not provide some value in scoping an approach to the investigation. So this document, you say, would fall under this category of documentation you're referring to?
If I understand what you're saying, this document would have supported that, what you've just read, that it would have formed an input into framing a terms of reference to get to the bottom of what was going on.
Yes, but the source of which was unidentified, the contents of which were unverified.
Yes, the document on the face of it is not authored. So when I got this, whoever authored this, and it may have been authored in phases because it's difficult to work out exactly when it was created. So, the scene you just read isn't, at the beginning of it, I say, Jabu gave certain documents. So at the end of it, when I comment that the it's because I didn't want to attribute a source to this document because it's not clear. But yes, the import of this document was serious enough to be included in the terms of reference or the general grounds of terms of reference.
So you would have, in drafting the terms of reference, relied on this document?
I wouldn't have put, well, we have to check whether, my terms of reference is very detailed. And I would need to go and see if I put any direct references to this document in it. Yeah. But typically my terms of reference would have used generic terms rather than Kanankura, Mossel Bay. I would not have been specific, yeah, but I would have covered the content of this in the terms of reference without doubt.
Yeah. So, one question. To the extent that the document forms part of your bundle or your statement, what was your intention about it?
Amongst others, these issues would need to be investigated.
Just repeat that.
And it was serious. Sorry. Amongst other reasons, the contents of this document would need to be investigated.
Yes.
So in addition to other issues, these would also have to be investigated.
Were they investigated?
There was no investigation to my knowledge. The terms of reference were aborted.
I see. What would you say to the chairperson should he approach this document?
Sorry, should he what?
How should the chairperson consider this document?
I would think it is a very important input into the determination to hold an inquiry, to make sure it's comprehensive, because it implies political as well as individual interference with the efficiency of the company, and it should be included in an investigation.
Yeah.
That investigation would need to take account of the fact that there are parties involved who might be implicated in this document, both specifically and generally.
Yeah. Given that the document was given to you, what, some 5 years ago, and it did not, as I understand, explicitly form part of your terms of reference, the ones you drafted. One, and number two, that the inquiry that was envisaged at the time didn't take place. Is there any value to be placed on the document? Any weight, I beg your pardon?
I would disagree, Mr. Chairman. I would say that the terms of reference were comprehensive and would have covered every part of this document.
Your terms of reference, the ones you drafted, do you know whether or not ESCOM did rely on those terms of reference to conduct?
They didn't.
Sorry, you may carry on.
They did not rely on those terms of reference. They rejected them.
Now, the terms of reference, I know you have exchanged them with ESCOM. Let's see whether what we found on page 71 of the bundle before us
Mr. Seleka, we finished the meeting of the 8th in Durban, the second meeting.
No, Chair, we haven't finished.
Yes.
The document has.
Doesn't the documents take us out
Yeah,
of the
maybe
context?
it's taking us away
I think
from.
we must try and finish
Yes.
what happened at the meeting
Yes.
and then move on so that the sequence of events
Follows, indeed.
is the right one. Yeah.
Indeed. Mr. Linnell?
I'm with you.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Okay. That's all right. Okay, we will come back to your terms of reference because they come after your meeting with the board. So maybe let's follow the sequence for a moment. And as I go back to the sequence, I would like to quickly read out to you, just by way of completion, what Ms. Dudumyeni says in her statement. 9.1. To meet on that. So it's furthermore, it's not true that I have hired performance and operational performance methods with me, including but not limited to load shedding. The claim by Mr. Tsotsi that I spoke about the war room of ESCOM is totally untrue. Now, according to your recollection, Mr. Linella, and I think I asked the question early this morning regarding load shedding and who would have talked about aspects relating to load shedding.
Ms. Meany would have been involved and would have had a contribution on that topic.
Was anything mentioned about the financial performance and operational matters of ESCOM?
Most definitely.
And who would have done the talking on those aspects?
Well, Jabu would have been one, Ms. Meany would have been one, and I'm quite certain Mr. Tsotsi would have contributed to that discussion.
And in your view, or not your view, but your recollection of how the meeting transpired, we may be asking this question again, but who would have been the main speaker on this point?
I can't say clearly. I think there was a discussion. I think Jabu was particularly informative, and he would have provided a lot of the discourse. Ms. Meany would have provided input. If anyone, maybe Mr. Tsotsi would have been subdued, but he would have contributed. But everyone contributed to the meeting. And the one thing that I don't have a recollection at that time of the war room specifically. It certainly arose later, and it may have been discussed, but I don't particularly remember the war room.
I see. Then maybe I will read the next, Romans 6 as the last paragraph. It says, I should further state that the most pressing issue was not about ESCOM, but was about Mr. Tsotsi himself. Prior to that meeting, he had shared with me his concern that the board wanted to get rid of him, and that some executive at ESCOM should be dismissed. He therefore needed help of legal nature urgently. Well, the point is alluded to in one of the paragraphs preceding. I think you've already dealt with it.
Well, maybe let's start with
The first
this one.
meeting was about ESCOM.
Yes, let's start with that one. Is it true that the discussion or the meeting was about Mr. Tsotsi himself?
There was no discussion about Mr. Tsotsi himself.
Yes. The discussion was about ESCOM.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Okay, I guess what...
Mr. Chairman, if I could comment, my recollection is I arrived after the others, and I think that is my recollection. If they had a prior meeting, as this document here suggests, they had a prior discussion, I don't know anything about that discussion, but
Yes.
the discussions I was part of were and its operations.
Yes. Of course, when you say the discussion was about ESCOM at the Durban meeting, that would be in line with your evidence on the discussion that Ms. Mieni had with you on the 6th at the President's official residence in Pretoria.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Because that discussion was about ESCOM and not about an individual.
That is correct.
Yes, okay. Continue, Mr. Slinger.
Thank you, Chair.
Or maybe I could just say to finish that paragraph for you, Mr. Slinger.
Indeed, Chair.
The last sentence of paragraph, Roman figure 6 on page 192 says that Mr. Tsotsi needed help of a legal nature urgently. In that meeting in Durban, did Mr. Tsotsi or did anybody talk about Mr. Tsotsi needing legal help himself as opposed to maybe ESCOM?
None whatsoever, Mr. Chairman, and none followed.
Yes.
As an outcome of that meeting, if I'd been asked to join them for the meeting to discuss that assistance,
Yeah.
there was no assistance following that meeting. So
Yes.
that supports the fact that it was not discussed.
Yes. Continue, Mr. Slinger.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Linnell, to complete on this, I wish to ask you to go to page 26.2. This is the supplementary statement which you have loosely before you.
I'm sorry, are you
This is
moving
the
away
second
from that
supplementary.
page, Mr. Slinger?
Page 26.2.
So you have moved away from 192.
I've moved away from that one, Chair.
Okay, I think there is one more thing to be put to Mr. Linnell. Mr. Linnell, Ms. Mieni says in Roman figure 7 at page 192 that she needs to reiterate that she did not know ESCOM executives, nor did she know any of their acts of alleged wrongdoing. She says she was in that meeting to advise Mr. Tsotsi as a colleague at his behest, and hence she introduced him to a legal advisor at that meeting in Durban, which must be you. What do you say about her statement that she did not know or does not know any ESCOM executives?
I don't remember her knowing any particular names,
Yes.
but we spoke about the functions, and the names would have been mentioned at least by Jabu, because in the document we've just referred to, two of the names are referred to in that particular document, and that document was discussed. So some of the names were discussed, but for certain the functions were discussed, and to my recollection, Mr. Tsotsi finally gave me the details of those three people in written format after the meeting.
Mr. Tsotsi said that at the meeting, one of the things that Mr. Zuma, one of the questions Mr. Zuma asked was whether Mr. Tsotsi knew the names or the identities of the executives who were to be suspended. Do you remember anything along those lines being asked by Mr. Zuma?
I don't remember that question.
You don't remember?
Mr. To be
Yes.
honest, it would have been rhetorical. Mr. Chairman, it would have been rhetorical in the sense that presumably Mr. Tsotsi would know his own staff.
Yes. Well, I think Mr. Tsotsi had made the point that it was quite clear that Mr. Zuma knew the issues that were supposed to be discussed at the meeting, and that at some stage during the meeting, he asked Mr. Tsotsi whether he knew who the executives were who were going to be suspended. And I think Mr. Tsotsi's evidence before the commission was that he responded to Mr. Zuma by confirming that he knew the executives to be suspended. And I think he was saying that because prior to that point, he said the discussion that had taken place, I think, before Mr. Zuma came in, had included the names of the executives, 3 executives. That was what he said.
Their names were properly mentioned in the discussions before, Mr. Chairman, in the first session.
Yes.
But to be honest, those names at that time bore no resonance in my mind, because obviously I would have recognized them. So I wasn't paying attention to names per se.
Yeah.
The focus was on the titles or their functions. But they might have mentioned the names.
Yes. So,
If I may.
but would you say that by the end of the meeting, Ms. Mieni did not know or would not know the names of the executives who were to be suspended? If they were mentioned?
I would think they were mentioned in everyone was mentioned in discussions.
Yeah,
Starting off by function and then by names.
yeah,
I can't remember the names, so I don't know if she would have remembered the names, but
yes,
the names were certainly mentioned
yes.
and confirmed in writing later.
She says she was at that meeting simply to advise Mr. Tsotsi as a colleague at Mr. Tsotsi's behest and to introduce Mr. Tsotsi to you. She says that is why she was at that meeting. What do you say to that?
Mr. Chairman, that's simply not true. It was absolutely clear that the purpose of the meeting was to propose and approve an inquiry into ESCOM's current performance. There was no other discussion which took place.
And one wonders whether, if that was the only purpose, whether it would not have been enough for her to give Mr. Tsotsi your number, and then Mr. Tsotsi could reach you and the two of you could make arrangements to meet, rather than have a meeting in Durban. Or can you not hear me, Mr. Elena?
No, it was indistinct, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm saying, one wonders whether, if that was the purpose of the meeting, namely that she was there to advise Mr. Tsotsi at Mr. Tsotsi's request, and that she was there to just introduce Mr. Tsotsi to you, whether it would not have been enough for her to give Mr. Tsotsi your number, and Mr. Tsotsi could give you a ring and the two of you could arrange to meet. You understand?
Wouldn't have had to fly to Durban to do that.
On a Sunday.
You're right, Mr. Chairman. I wouldn't have had to fly to Durban to do that.
Yes. Mr. Seleka?
Mr. Chairman, if I could elaborate.
Yes.
Just on Council's earlier question, at the end of that meeting, we had identified the 3 people, so everyone in the room knew there were going to be those 3 people proposed for suspension. So we left the meeting with that knowledge.
Yes, yes. So,
We might have got formal names later, but we certainly knew
yeah,
that was the outcome of the meeting.
yes. And at that stage, were there only 3 executives who were discussed and who were going to be suspended in terms of the discussion at that meeting, or was it 4 executives?
To my recollection, there was 3 people mentioned, and we put 3 people in the documentation. At a later stage, the 3 became 4.
Yes.
And the 3 morphed into 4. So when the 3 became 4, I cannot recall, but I know in the documentation that I did immediately after this meeting, and including the narratives on the motivation for suspensions of those three, they refer to specifically those three.
Yes. Okay, Mr. Tsotsi also gave evidence along the same lines, namely that at the Durban meeting, only 3 executives were discussed as executives who would be suspended. He said it was only later, I think at the meeting of the 11th, that, at some stage, the name of the financial director was included. Is that your recollection as well?
I think, Mr. Chairman, that during the discussions on the 8th, there was probably discussion about a host of people and positions. But at the end of the meeting, the view was those were the 3 key positions. And I would have thought Mr. Tsotsi's input on those 3 positions would have been quite critical because he would have known that best. No one else would have known that.
Okay. Mr. Seleka.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Linnell, indeed, you do say in the supplementary statement, which I was going to refer you to on page 26.2, your page 2, paragraph 14.
Yes.
Well,
14.
yeah, but we can start at 13 because there you're right. I would not have known the identity of the individuals beforehand. But at a meeting on 8, which I believe cannot recall when the 4th executive was added. Ms. Molefe had not been identified, had not been initially considered as potentially impending the investigation and not part of my proposal. Is
That
that
is
what?
correct, Mr. Chairman.
But we understand that the ultimate decision was that 4 executives should be suspended, and in fact, that's what happened.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
But to go back to the meeting in Durban, was the conclusion of the meeting, therefore, that 1, there would be an inquiry that would be conducted at ESCOM into the affairs of ESCOM. 2, 3 executives would be suspended and they were identified who they were. 4, that Mr. Zuma was going to speak to the minister, brief the minister of public enterprises. 4, Mr. Tsotsi would speak to the board of ESCOM. Is that how the meeting concluded?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Is there another point I've left out of importance that was concluded at that meeting?
I think, Mr. Chairman, there was the general statement that would have been discussed in the presence of the President where my position on doing the inquiry, which set out a couple of the principles of that inquiry, which were the independence of it and that, and I think I've documented that in one of the statements. So there was a conclusion come to that the inquiry would take place, it would have to be done in this particular way. One of those implications were that these people were to be suspended. But there were other conditions mentioned at the end of the meeting.
Yeah, just deal with them because I want to have a full picture of the conclusion. conclusion of that meeting?
I think, Mr. Chairman, to be clear on that point, that is an important point because that was the point of departure which led ultimately to the terms of reference and the approach of the inquiry, which followed all the way through. So the principles agreed about independence, transparency, etc., followed all the way through from that very moment into the media briefing, into the terms of reference, and they were consistently applied.
Okay, before you go there, one, your role. Did the meeting in Durban agree as to what your role would be in the inquiry? Or was there an understanding of what your role was going to be?
I left with the understanding that I would be proposed to the board to be the coordinator of the inquiry.
Yes. What were agreed to be the features of the inquiry? You have told me about transparency. What else? Independence?
It had to be independent, it had to be transparent, it had to be thorough. I think I've documented some of those principles.
Yeah, you can look at the document if you want to refresh your memory. Was it already mentioned at that meeting that the inquiry should take no longer than 3 months, or did that come later?
That was one of them, correct? And there was a discussion about that, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
in the sense that in our earlier discussions, if there is a long-winded investigation, it comes to naught in any event, and it creates more damage than good. So you have to go in, do it thoroughly and quickly, and identify the main issues. Otherwise, it will just peter out. And so 3 months was a issue. Council, can you remind me do you know where we detailed those? Was it in the affidavit or in the supplementary?
You could go to page 32 of the affidavit, paragraph 20.
Which is on black page number?
32.
Page 32.
Yes. Paragraph 20, 21, well, mainly 21.
Okay, yeah.
Well, you can just read into the record the principles that you set out there, or what you say from paragraph 20 to 21.9. Do you want to read that quickly?
Would you like me to, certainly?
Yes.
Paragraph 21 starts, the President was clearly familiar with the purpose of the meeting, and we provided a summary of what was proposed. Brackets, arising from the earlier discussions referred to above. This included a number of key principles. One, for the inquiry to have credibility, it needed to be open, independent, and comprehensive. It needed to be free from internal interference. Two, it needed to be quick, as lengthy previous inquiries in other state entities led to greater harm than good. Three, it needed the capacity and capability of the best investigators across commercial, financial, and technical disciplines. It was therefore not suitable for one entity to conduct it. 4, it needed to be seen to be credible. Sound communication with stakeholders and the public was necessary. And then I comment on something which is in the final version of the terms of reference, which I cannot recall mentioning here, but it was part of my thinking then was was you needed an overseer to comply or to deliver on the points of being credible and transparent. In an inquiry of this nature, the big risk is no one really knows the truth.
Yes. I thought the principles went up to 21.9.
Okay.
Yeah, I think 21.6.
Sorry, Dave.
21.6, you say the board and the minister must be in agreement and supportive and seen to be so. 21.7, you discussed the implications of the board and PFMA approvals. 21.8, the matter of suspension of top executives was discussed. The rationale supporting suspension was that 21.8.1, if investigators were going to have the freedom to follow the evidence, there needed to be an environment free from fear or intimidation. These conditions do not have to be active to exist, and the passive presence of key people can inhibit openness. These were precautionary suspensions, and those included would be counseled on that point, as would the media release. 21.8.2, the risk to the business of suspensions of key people would be managed by appointment of capable subordinates. A strong communication strategy would convince stakeholders and the public that this was a positive and not a negative approach. The inquiry would be limited to 3 months. Your own role would be that of a coordinator, and you would interface with the board. And then at 22, you say the president listened to these views and asked 1 or 2 questions and then agreed. He undertook to speak to the minister, and Mr. Tsotsi was going to speak to the board. Is that how the meeting ended?
And yes, Mr. Tsotsi was going to communicate with the board. I was going to draft him documents to communicate to the board that evening, which I did. And the president was going to talk to the minister, and all those points ultimately fed through into all the documents. So, for example, in the board proposal, it deals with issues of the approval of the Ministry of Finance. So, all those issues which are reported here were ultimately followed through in the documents dated later.
Okay, Mr. Slayer.
Thank you, Chair. So, Mr. Linnell, it appears to be, and maybe you can verify this or confirm this to the chairperson, that these principles were coming from you, the underlying principle of the nature of the inquiry. Is that correct?
I'd like to agree with that. I think so.
Now, we know that when you met with Ms. Mieni on the afternoon of the 6th of March, 2015, in Pretoria, she told you that the president wanted an investigation into the affairs of ESCOM. At that stage, did she talk to you about any principles that would govern that investigation, or did she talk to you about any important features of that investigation, or is the position that that was not discussed at that stage, but by the time you arrived at the Durban meeting, you had ideas of what principles should be followed?
I think a bit of all those, Mr. Chairman. So during the discussion on the 6th, certainly some of these principles would have been discussed. I would have raised them. But on this, I think on the Saturday morning, I stand corrected, but I would have commented on one of the documents that I ultimately did. I started drafting a document, first version of a document, early on the Sunday morning or late on the Saturday or early Saturday morning, which started recording some of these kind of things. So they were in my mind, certainly. I'm not sure if I would have mentioned them, I suppose, on the 6th, but they were very clearly entrenched by the 8th.
Now, at that meeting on the 6th of March in Pretoria, between yourself and Ms. Mieni, did the issue of the suspension of the executives arise, or did that only arise at the meeting, at the Durban meeting?
The principle of suspensions would have arose on the 6th, yes.
So the two of you did discuss that in Pretoria?
Correct. Not the people, but the principle of suspending people at the top of the organization.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You, in Pretoria, in your meeting with Ms. Mieni, you are saying that there was a need, there would be a need for some executives to be suspended was discussed, but the actual names were not discussed. Is that right?
That is correct.
But did the discussion include portfolios? In other words, to say the executives who would need to be suspended would be those who occupied certain or who were leading certain portfolios? Or that did not also arise? It was just the suspension, that there may have to be a suspension without saying which positions would be affected or which persons would be affected.
Mr. Chairman, on the 6th, I wouldn't have understood the organizational structure as to who was who. So that wouldn't have been an issue at all, but that came clear on the 8th. As to, I think Mr. Tsotsi had a role in identifying positions of influence in the business.
So who actually came up with the whole idea that there would need to be suspensions on the 6th? Was it you or was it Ms. Mieni?
Mr. Chairman, I would have said to you that it would have been my recommendation. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I can't say that it was not also on her mind, and in conversation there was an accepted discourse between the two of us that was necessary. Mm-hmm. But without a doubt, it would have intuitively been an idea I would have said, that if you're going to do this properly, this must happen.
Yes.
She might have had the same thought, I can't recall that.
Yes. But the actual portfolios that would be affected by the suspension of the executives, those portfolios were only identified at the Durban meeting. Is that correct or not?
To my recollection, yes, and Mr. Tsotsi would have been the one who knew those roles better than anyone. And maybe Jabu, but certainly Mr. Tsotsi would have been.
Mm. Now, at the Durban meeting, do you recall whether it fell upon you to raise the issue of the suspensions, or whether somebody else in the meeting happened to be the first one to raise the issue of suspensions? And if so, who was that?
Mr. Chairman, I'd have no recollection. At the time, there was no thought that that was an issue. The discussion was around,
yes,
we have to do an investigation. What is the best approach to do it?
Yes.
And the suspensions were no more of an issue in say, my recollection of mind, yes, than it being fair and transparent and thorough. They were all part of the same approach.
Yes. Now, do you remember whether the actual names came from Mr. Jabu Maswangai or Mr. Tsotsi? Do you remember, or is that something you don't remember? Or who the names came from?
What I do recall is Mr. Tsotsi having a role in the debate about the positions, and then ultimately, as far as I recall, and maybe it's formed by, I got the names from him in writing to make sure I wrote them down correctly. He sent those to me. Jabu would certainly have mentioned some of those names, because in the document we referred to Energy Crisis 2 just now. Two of those names are in his document.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Linnell, if you will, on your supplementary affidavit, paragraph 12, just for completeness, talking of the suspensions concerned much. I would have considered